Reading 84 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Maurice Nicoll. Quarmide, Uccle, July 14, 1945. On self-remembering. We should remember ourselves at least once a day. It is very important to remember oneself, and in every act of self-remembering lies one of the great inner meanings of this work and of all esotericism in general. If we cannot remember ourselves once a day, then we should remember ourselves 3 times a day. That is to say, we should make a bigger effort. Remembering oneself is just as if an actor on the stage who had become completely absorbed in the role he was playing suddenly remembered that he was merely acting the role, and that he was really somebody else, and not the part he was playing. This would mean that he would wake up. He would no longer take himself as the hero or the king or the cardinal that he was playing. But what do? We are just like that actor who has forgotten that he is playing a role. We find ourselves fitted into the parts belonging to every phase of tragedy and comedy, but we identify with everything. We do not see that we ourselves are something else, something different, and so we do not remember ourselves, and so we are said in the work to be asleep. A little while ago it was asked, why should we not identify? It is possible to answer this question from 1,000 points of view. One great reason is that if we identify, we are not doing this work. The question is like saying, why should we do this work? There's absolutely no reason why we should do this work if we do not wish to. This work is only for people who are looking for something. If we identify, we cannot remember ourselves. As I said, the work lays the greatest emphasis on self-remembering. It says that the most important thing we have to do is to remember ourselves, and it adds that this can only be understood when we realize that we do not remember ourselves. Now, if a man is identified, he is not remembering himself. There are degrees and qualities of identifying. Some slight forms of identifying are trivial and unimportant. On the other hand, some slight forms of identifying lead very speedily to bigger forms, and of these one has to be careful, just as one has to be careful about all small things that start up in oneself innocently, so to speak, and very speedily lead into unpleasant places in ourselves, such as very unpleasant forms of negative emotion. One has to be just as careful where one walks inside oneself after a time, as where one walks in the world, visible to one's senses. Through self-observation, our internal world becomes visible to us. That is, we become conscious of it and learn to recognize where we are in it and what takes us down in it and what takes us upwards in regard to our experiences and the small degrees and level of being that we all possess. Can you afford to walk in your sleep too long? Since identifying is the enemy of self-remembering, and since self-remembering is our supreme task, it is clear that we have to study our forms of identifying. With what have you been identified most today? Or let me ask you another question. Have you remembered yourself today? Of course, we do not take our lives in the sense of parts that we have been given to a play. The work says that we start from our lives just as they are, and that this is the best starting point for the work. We do not have to break off our lives and go into monasteries or hermitages. For instance, our lives may go on just the same as before, but if we begin to understand what the work means, we take our lives in a different way. I always find this difficult to explain to those who do not yet catch a glimpse of what is meant. Suppose you were to go on a stage where there were hundreds and thousands of actors dressed up in all sorts of costumes, quarreling and making love and murdering and so on, and you realized, to your horror, that they were all fast asleep and were completely identified with their parts, which means that they were taking themselves to be what they had been cast to be in the big drama. What would you do? You would probably seize hold of the nearest one and shake him violently and try to make him wake up. You might shout in his ear and say, "Don't be so silly. Don't stick that knife into that person. You are asleep. You forget who you really are." And what do you think the result would be? Probably the knife would be pushed into you. Now, if we can see that our lives are somewhat similar to parts given to actors, and that each of us has a different part best suited to him, our attitude would change. What does best suited to him mean? It means best suited to him to wake up from. If you take your life on earth as an end in itself, you can never get to the attitude that the work teaches. The work takes life as a means to another end. If you take life as an end in itself, if you take life as an end in itself, can you ever cease to identify with it? You know how in various myths and fairy stories and esoteric legends, there is the idea that the hero is sent out into the world to seek for something, and he is warned not to forget whence he came. This is one thing that he must always remember. Let me quote from an ancient hymn which contains a great deal of teaching. Here the son of kings is sent by his parents down into Egypt, into the world, to bring back a pearl. But after he had been in the world some time, he forgot that he was the son of kings. He forgot the pearl and lay in a deep sleep. He was awakened from sleep and remembered himself. I remembered that I was a son of kings, he said, and my free soul longed for its natural state. I remembered the pearl for which I had been sent to Egypt, and I snatched away the pearl and turned to go back to my father's house. In this allegory, you will see that the prince remembered his divine origin. He remembered that he was not what he had begun to take himself in life. Many ancient teachings speak of life as being an illusion, but this is not easy to understand. The work does not speak about life as an illusion, but it says a great deal about our taking life in the wrong, illusory way, and it constantly emphasizes that we must learn to take it in the right way. In this connection, it is constantly speaking about identifying both with ourselves and with the events of life. This identifying, whose direction is inwards and outwards, keeps us asleep and makes it impossible for us to remember ourselves, and in consequence makes it impossible for certain influences to reach us that can help us, consisting in certain emotions, certain thoughts, certain feelings, not derived from our business affairs, our daily existence, or life as seen, as it appears to be. The illusion of life lies, the work says, in man's thinking he can do, in man's thinking he is conscious, in man's thinking that he is a unity. The work says that in life, everything happens in the only way it possibly can. When you apparently act in life, when you apparently do something in life, you are doing the only thing that you can do. It is not you who are doing it. When you begin to see this, when you begin to realize your mechanicalness in this way, you are already beginning to remember yourself. You are already beginning to be separated from the machine of yourself and to approach something that lies behind the machine of yourself, in the direction of real I. This is why the work says that realization of one's own mechanicalness is a form of self-remembering. In this kind of self-remembering, you are aware that what you are doing and saying and thinking is not really you. You become a spectator of yourself, and you see that all that you have called you and your life is an illusion, in the sense that it is all happening, and in that sense it is not real. It is not reality. When I see that an event is entangling me, and that I am reacting to this event quite mechanically, the whole business becomes unreal to me, because where I thought before that I was doing, I was acting, I was seeing, I see it now as it that is acting. In the same way, in separating from one's inner fantasies and thoughts that spring from false personality, from vanity, and so on, a person may have a moment of self-remembering in which he escapes from their hypnotic power and sees that they are trying to get hold of him, and that is their real object, namely to put him to sleep again. You must remember that everything in life seeks to keep us asleep. In the legend of Endymion, it is related that the moon kept Endymion asleep because this was the only way in which she could keep her power over him. Remember that the work teaches that we live in a world of sleeping people, in which everything happens, and that we are also asleep. The only difference is that we are trying to wake up. We cannot change life. A man must begin with himself, a woman with herself. We can begin to change ourselves, but this is impossible unless we begin to see that we ourselves are asleep, that we are identified with the tragic or comic parts given us in life, and that we have forgotten ourselves, and that we do not even try to remember ourselves. Are you overcome by your difficulties? Do you feel no one has ever been in such adverse circumstances? Or, on the contrary, do you feel yourself the happiest person in the world? In self-remembering, one does not start from this situation, this state of affairs, this domestic scene, this particular event one is in. Life becomes our teacher only when we understand that it offers us different circumstances, different experiences, different events at different moments with which not to identify. Life is a series of outer events and inner states, and they are always shifting and turning. If we stick at every point, then we are identified all the way round. We take everything personally, as being ourselves, like the actor who takes every role he has to play as himself. Then we are indeed asleep, and being turned round like little wheels by the big wheel of life. When all traces of individuality fail collectively, collectivity grows. We have to struggle hard not to become only small wheels driven by life, by the circle of events. The secret lies in not identifying and in self-remembering. But if you take every little upset, every domestic incident, seriously and with full identifying, how then can you work or expect to work? You do not even realize you are playing a typical role that millions of others have played or are playing, and that you will not get free from it unless you wake up and see that you are not remembering yourself. Now we each have a circle of different eyes that revolve. Each plays its role: pathetic, silly, fine, serio-comic, tragic, and various other stock parts. The trouble is that we do not play these roles, but they play us. Really, to play a role in the work sense, a man must be conscious. To play a role consciously is an example of what the work calls doing. Only a conscious man can do. As we are, roles play us. So it is a good thing to observe them and not identify with them so much, to see them acting in oneself and yet not feel that one is them, to say silently, I am not this. This is to begin to remember oneself as different from these eyes. But every day we must practice self-remembering, at first simply by stopping everything, by being not in anything, not connected with anything in life or in ourselves as life has made us. Now remember, a man identified with himself cannot remember himself because he has no horizon above him. He is limited by himself. A man who blames everybody, a man who ascribes everything to himself, is identified with himself and really dead. Let us recall the first 3 levels of consciousness. 1. Sleep in bed. 2. So-called waking consciousness, in which people live and also kill each other. And 3. Self-remembering. It is only to this level, the level of self-remembering, that help can penetrate and actually reach us from higher levels of the universe of being, that is, from conscious humanity. That is why it is so important to practice self-remembering, to try to do it, and gradually find the way to do it. If the intention is sincere and the aim intelligent and based on an understanding of the work, the way will be found. Sometimes when you watch a person, you may wonder what would happen if he or she saw their forms of identifying in a flash, their mannerisms, their dress, their intonations, their expressions, the seriousness with which they take themselves and their position. Yes, and the same applies to ourselves. I will tell you a story about forgetting to remember oneself. There was once an island on which a number of people landed from a ship in order to rehearse a play. One person was cast for the part of a villain. Another was a spy, another a noble woman, another a brave man, another a miser, another a hero, another a misunderstood wife, another a misunderstood husband, another a long-suffering person, and so on. The first day they all acted the play and enjoyed it, and afterwards laughed at one another's parts. But the island had peculiar properties. As the days went on, each time they acted this play, they began to feel more and more that they were actually the parts they acted. And then everything went wrong, and they remained on the island, and the ship vanished, leaving only a little boat behind.